Hello, comrades. Today I am with Carlos Martinez. And firstly, could you present yourself?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Michal, for inviting me. Very happy to be with you today. I'm an author and researcher and activist from London, England. I run the blog Invent the Future and have run that since I think 2013, with a focus on politics and history, particularly in relation to actually existing socialism, and including previously existing socialism. And my first book was about that, The End of the Beginning, Lessons of the Soviet Collapse. That's about the collapse of the Soviet Union. That came out in 2019. I'm currently working on a book about Chinese socialism in the 21st century. And in terms of activism, I'm co-founder of the No Cold War campaign and a co-editor of Friends of Socialist China.
Okay, firstly, I want to say something about your YouTube channel that you made interview with Radhika Desai 8 months ago about capital. And in last month, I recorded audiobook with Capital. It was very long work because it was 57 episodes for reading me this capital. Now I am try to make lectures about capital. So I Google all the lectures about capital, and also I found your work that you participated in the group of the reading capital. Yes.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, but let's talk about China. In your channel, you made some presentation about the lies that are now used by the Western propaganda against China. For me, it is not problem that the Western bourgeoisie lies against China. For me, the problem is that very often these lies are used by the leftist people in Western countries, by the social democrats, and also by the people so-called very radical communists who are saying that we are true communists and the China is I don't know, imperialist, capitalist state, and so I want to ask you about some things. So, firstly, maybe now the most famous lie is about religion in China, that the Islam religion is banned in China, and the one of the nation which are living in China, the Uyghur, are were killed because they are Muslims. The mosque in the Xinjiang region was destroyed, and it is forbidden to going there. So could you say something about this?
Yeah, sure. I mean, in relation to the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, this propaganda war against China has reached fever pitch. It's at a level of hysteria now, and Xinjiang, the accusation of genocide or cultural genocide in Xinjiang, seems to be the most prominent component of this propaganda war, as it stands at the moment. China's accused of forced sterilization of Uyghur women, of using forced labor in the production of cotton, in the production of solar panels. It's accused of holding perhaps 1 million people in they called concentration camps. And these stories have penetrated popular consciousness. We're actually at a stage where it's becoming quite difficult to say anything positive about China in countries like Britain, and I'm sure in France as well, because if you talk about China's successes that it's had, that I think we'll talk about later, in relation to lifting hundreds of millions out of poverty, or containing the COVID-19 pandemic, or assisting developing countries, or investing in renewable energy, or improving the living standards of its people, you talk about any of those things and you're going to be accused of being a genocide denier. That's all anybody wants to talk about now in relation to China, is the situation in Xinjiang, is the supposed human rights violations of Uyghur people. And, genocide is a very serious charge. And it's something one really shouldn't take the accusation of genocide and just throw it around very carelessly and without evidence, because it actually cheapens the concept. It's kind of an insult to the victims of real genocides that have actually happened. The facts of the matter kind of speak for themselves. The Uyghur population over the course of the last 10 years has increased from around 10 million to nearly 13 million. So that's an increase of more than 25%. And in the same period, while the Uyghur population increased by 25%, the Han Chinese population in Xinjiang increased by only 2%, right? So that sort of undercuts this idea that there's a genocide taking place, or that there's been forced sterilization of women so that Uyghur people can't have children. How does the population increase if children aren't being born? Actually, the opposite is the case. China from 1978 until very recently had a one-child policy where families were only supposed to have one child, but ethnic minorities, including Uyghur people, were not part of that. There was a three-child policy for ethnic minorities. So, in fact, in as much as there's been discrimination against any group in China in relation to birth control, it's discrimination against Han Chinese people. Which the one-child policy is a separate and very complex topic. But this idea that Uyghur people have been prevented from having children and from their population expanding is nonsense and has got no basis in evidence or facts whatsoever. Meanwhile, we're told there's a genocide taking place. Well, why isn't there a refugee crisis? When was there ever a genocide in history that wasn't also associated with a refugee crisis? Why don't we see refugee camps set up for Uyghur people on the border with Pakistan, with Kazakhstan, with Afghanistan? The US waged its genocidal wars against Iraq, against Libya. It's been involved in the war against Syria. And this has led to the displacement of literally millions of people, to a refugee crisis of almost unprecedented proportions. And yet you're telling me that China is carrying out a genocide and that's not creating any refugees. If you push these arguments a little bit, then people will retreat to something a little bit softer, which is that China's engaged in a cultural genocide, and that it's trying to destroy Uyghur traditions, the Uyghur kind of cultural identity, the Uyghur beliefs, their right to practice their religion and so on. And yet, anyone who goes to Xinjiang would have to say that this is a completely false, a completely incorrect, a completely unfair accusation. One example is that there are 25,000 mosques in Xinjiang, and that number has increased threefold since 1980. So in that period of 40 years, there have been almost 20,000 mosques constructed. The number of mosques has increased by a factor of 3. And actually, Xinjiang's got one of the highest concentrations of mosques per population, or per Muslim population, in the world. All schools in Xinjiang teach the Uyghur language. All students in Xinjiang learn the Uyghur language, regardless of whether they themselves are of Uyghur ethnicity. So yeah, I've been to Xinjiang. I've been to Urumqi. I went with a group of friends, including Danny Haifong, who you're probably familiar with, a couple of years ago. We walked around freely. We saw absolutely no evidence whatsoever of religious oppression, of ethnic oppression. We saw hundreds of Uyghur Muslims on the streets wearing distinctive Uyghur clothing, including many women wearing headscarves, just living their ordinary lives, practicing their traditions. We went to Uyghur restaurants, we went to Uyghur cafes. There was no pork available, it was only halal food. The alcohol wasn't available. Normally, if you go to a restaurant in China, then pork is one of the main foodstuffs. Alcohol is available, but in Uyghur restaurants, that's not the case. You can hear, I don't speak Mandarin Chinese either, but you can certainly hear the difference in the languages. The Uyghur language sounds much more kind of Turkic, and we heard the Uyghur language being spoken freely everywhere. All the road signs are in both Uyghur and Chinese writing. You see newspapers, you see books in the Uyghur language. So this idea that there's a cultural genocide is, again, it's like it comes out of nowhere. One specific charge that's talked about a lot is that the Chinese operate these prison camps where they lock up Uyghur Muslims in order to re-educate them. And as I said before, the number of prisoners that people talk about is 1 million, right? 1 million prisoners out of a Uyghur population of 13 million. So that's a huge proportion. What is that? 0.7 7 or 8%. And it's alleged that the purpose of these prison camps is to eradicate Uyghur Muslim culture and brainwash people into supporting the government. But again, there's where's the evidence? We've seen a few satellite photos of a few prisons, but that doesn't prove anything at all. Like, all countries have prisons, right? We've seen a small handful of witness accounts, but frankly, these aren't credible. Once you've got a group such as the World Uyghur Congress, which is openly and overtly dedicated to ending Communist Party rule in China and to creating an independent country of East Turkmenistan, then and you give that organization access to primetime Western media, it's not that difficult to believe that they do a bit of acting. It's there's plenty of examples of this in history. One of the most obvious being the story about Iraqi soldiers in 1991 throwing Kuwaiti babies out of incubators. It's not easy to hide 1 million prisoners. That's actually quite a lot of people, right? That's more than the population of Cyprus, for example. Wouldn't you need a lot of buildings and a lot of infrastructure to support a prison population of 1 million? Where are the satellite pictures of all that? There was a Pakistani Canadian comrade, Omar Latif, who unfortunately passed away recently. He was a trade unionist and had visited Xinjiang a couple of times. And he makes this point, the US has got satellite technology such that from outer space, it can read a number plate on a vehicle, on a car. And you're telling me that it can't find prison facilities that are holding 1 million people in Western China. In relation to these facilities, what the Chinese authorities say is that they're not concentration camps. Yes, they have some vocational colleges. These are designed to address the problem of religious extremism and violent separatism, which have historically, for the last 20, 30 years, been very serious problems in China. They combine classes on sociology and ethics with classes on helping people develop specific skills to help them get jobs. So the basic idea is to improve people's life prospects so that they're less susceptible, they're less likely to be radicalized by fundamentalist and sectarian groups. So they're trying to use economic development and education to curb extremism. Actually, that's what the United Nations recommends. If you look at the UN task force on countering terrorism, that's what the UN considers to be the best way to deal with terrorism, to focus on economic and educational factors. And if you want to compare it with something, if you wanted a negative example, then maybe the best place to look at is a corner of the island of Cuba, which remains the colonial property of the United States, i.e. Guantanamo, and see what they do with suspected terrorists there. They torture them, they waterboard them, they hold them in cages, they expose them to loud music 24 hours a day so that they can't sleep. They leave them, burning in the hot sun. It's utterly and completely outrageous the way that these people are treated and have been treated for 20 years. Since 2001, this prison camp, this torture camp has been open. That's how the US says that it deals with terrorism. And then they have the audacity to accuse China of abusing the human rights of Muslims. So look, we've got these very serious allegations, these very serious accusations. Instead of a trial by media, there should be an investigation, an independent investigation that's organized at the level of the UN. The Chinese government has extended an invitation to the UN Human Rights Commissioner and her team. So let that happen. Actually, when it comes down to it, the West isn't interested in a proper and unbiased investigation because they know it won't say what they want it to say. So their media train will run out of steam. And this is a really familiar pattern, what we see with these accusations of the imperialist media using this slander, using this fake news to win public support for their foreign policy. I'm sure you're familiar and your viewers are familiar with what happened in Vietnam in 1965 with the Tonkin incident, which the US, was a fake news episode that the US took advantage of to massively escalate its war in Vietnam, a war which ended up killing at least 3 million people. I'm sure I don't need to mention what happened in Iraq in 2003, and this story that Saddam Hussein and the Iraqi government had access to weapons of mass destruction. In Britain, there was a dossier released that said that Iraq could attack Britain at 45 minutes notice with weapons of mass destruction, right? So we took those lies that were purposefully created by intelligence agencies and used them to destroy a country, to bomb a country into the Stone Age and kill hundreds of thousands of people in the process. We had the same thing with Libya, right? They said that Gaddafi's armies were preparing a massacre in Benghazi. They said that Gaddafi's armies were formed of sub-Saharan African slaves. They said that Gaddafi was using rape as a weapon of war. Every trick in the book, they pulled it out, and they used that to build public support for a genocidal war, a war that killed tens of thousands of people, and again destroyed a country, again bombed a country into the Stone Age. That was 2011. 10 years on, what's the situation of Libya now? Libya was the most advanced country in the continent of Africa. Libya was the country with the highest human development index in all of Africa. It was a country where its oil profits were genuinely shared among the people and where people's living standards were very high. Western countries destroyed it. And in order to gain public support for that act of wanton destruction, we told lies, our media told lies. And we've got a clear parallel in Xinjiang with what happened there. That's the dynamic. All of this propaganda is very much connected with building the broadest possible public support for the US-led new Cold War on China. And I don't say that there are no problems in Xinjiang. Is there prejudice? Is there some ethnic profiling by the forces of the state? Is there some underlying tensions between different ethnicities, different religions, different communities? Is there some element of racism? As is Han chauvinism an enduring problem in China? Do Han Chinese people tend to do better in school than their Uyghur counterparts? Do Han Chinese people tend to earn, have a bigger income than their Uyghur counterparts? All of that, may be the case, right? But actually, the trajectory in China is towards solving these problems, to improving on these things. Like struggling against Han chauvinism is literally written into the Chinese constitution. If only struggling against white supremacy were written into the constitution in Britain or the US, right? Active measures are taken in China to improve life for ethnic minorities, including Uyghurs. And one interesting statistic, and I think we're maybe going to talk about COVID-19 later, but the number of deaths from COVID-19 in the province of Xinjiang, which has a population of 22 or 23 million, is zero. So there have been 0 COVID deaths in Xinjiang. Compare this to the US, where there have been over 600,000 COVID deaths, and where if you're Black or you're Latino, then you're more than twice as likely to die from COVID. Like life expectancy for African Americans dropped in 2020 by a full 3 years, right? For white people, it dropped by 1 year. So, you know, a 1 year decrease in life expectancy is shocking enough. And, you know, what a horrible indictment of the way that the US and the West in general has dealt with the pandemic. But a 3-year decrease is a scandal. You know, why aren't we talking about that? Why isn't that a global media sensation? But instead, the newspapers every single day, you can read The Guardian, The Independent, The Times, The Daily Mail, Fox News, CNN, BBC. Always there's some or other slander about human rights abuses in Xinjiang. Xinjiang may well have its problems, but they're nothing, you know, they're not even in the same ballpark as the problems of racism and religious discrimination and ethnic discrimination in the US and in the West in general.
Okay, thank you for your response. You said about the imperialist lies and provocation that in Tonkin in Vietnam. For Poles, the most famous provocation was the Gliwice provocation. It was lied spread by the German media in 1st September 1939, and they informed the German citizen that Poles attacked Germany. 1st September 1939, that Gliwice was a city in the Silesia in the border with Poland, and they all the 1st September they said that it's Poles who attacked Germany, so we have to make defend ourselves. Today everybody forget about this, but it is very famous, prowokacja gliwicka. And there is one very cruel joke about the war in Libya in 2011. The question is why they attacked Libya in 2011. Do you know why?
Right, yeah, go on.
It's a joke. It was 100th anniversary of the first using the planes to bombing a people by the Italian in 1911. They attacked Libya in 1911, and it was first time when the plane was using to bomb the civil population. And 100 years later, NATO first the same things. So it's good to remember. And this accusation about the China who repressed the Muslim population are very funny in France, because France, I don't know if you are familiar with this. There are very many demonstrations in Muslim world against Macron. They burn the French flag. They burn the portrait of Macron. In Turkey, in Bangladesh, in Pakistan, many countries, Muslim population are against French. The Arab, the Muslim states don't want to buy the French products. It is because of the rhetoric of Macron. Now we have the electoral campaign in France, and we have three big candidates, Macron, Le Pen, and Eric Zemmour. They have licitation who is the most against the Muslim population. And the most psycho is Eric Zemmour. I don't know if you are familiar with him or not, but he is telling that 5 million people who are citizens of France who are Muslim, he wants to send out from France, because he said that it is not possible to assimilate these people, so we have to take them to the boats and send to Africa. And in the same moment when they are using all the time this anti-Muslim propaganda, they accuse China that China is anti-Muslim. So it's very, very funny when the bourgeois propaganda try to explain this for the French people, because it's very bizarre. I would like
it's a big irony, and one point I just wanted to add to that, apart from, like you say, the contradiction and the irony of countries that for whom Islamophobia is like their second nature. It's part of their whole way of operating. And for countries like us that have colonized the Islamic world and that have been bombing the Islamic world for the last 20 years, that enact, racist prejudice against Muslim peoples at home. So there's this irony that suddenly people like Mike Pompeo, who's like a noted Islamophobe and a Christian fundamentalist, is suddenly taking up the rights of Muslim people. But one other thing to consider is that no Muslim majority country has actually joined in with these accusations and these slanders against China about what's happening in Xinjiang. You've had delegations that have gone from Pakistan, from Iran, from Palestine, from Syria, from Lebanon, from a number of Muslim majority countries, and all of them have said, actually, this is what you see is a completely different picture to what's painted in the Western media. Actually, these allegations and these slanders are completely untrue. Literally, the Palestinian, Iranian, and Pakistani ambassadors to China went on a trip, an observer mission to Xinjiang 2 or 3 months ago. And they all said the same thing, that we were very impressed with the levels of ethnic harmony. We were very impressed to go into schools and see that people are all learning the Uyghur languages. We went to mosques and we prayed ourselves in mosques, and we saw that there were hundreds of other Uyghur people, Muslim people there, praying and practicing their culture and their religion. So this says a lot, that the countries that are making the accusations against China are the same countries that have been attacking Muslim populations and Muslim countries for the last 20 years, if you want to look at it from that perspective, or you can zoom out and say for the last 100 years plus. And then the actual Muslim majority countries don't join in with these accusations. So that indicates very clearly that the real dynamic here is one of imperialism.
Okay, one of the most important lies, not only against China, but against socialism, is telling that socialism is always poverty, that the shops are without the merchandise and stuff like this. And they make example, for example, that why the Western Germany or Western world was better than Eastern world, or why the I don't know, South Korea is better than North Korea. Could you compare two countries with, I think, very similar history? One is India, second is China, that this is great civilization, existed from thousand years. In the history of humanity, the China and India, one time it was China the most developed region, after it was India the most developed region. And these two countries, they are independent from 1940s. So they have the similar population. Could you compare these two countries?
Sure. So, as you say, it's kind of an obvious comparison, because they won their liberation at about the same time. India won its independence from Britain in 1947. China completed its revolution in 1949, and the People's Republic of China was proclaimed in 1949. They've got a very similar population size, currently 1.4 billion in China and 1.3 billion in India. At the time, they had a very similar development level, which was a very, very low development level. So they're both, enormous kind of post-colonial Asian countries. And yeah, in terms of their progress and their development over the last 70 years, there's an enormous difference. I mean, the most obvious metric that kind of encompasses a lot of different factors in relation to health and living standard is life expectancy. So life expectancy in both of the countries was under 40 at that time, in the late 1940s. In China now it's 77, which is a few years above the global average. In India, it's 68, which is a few years below the global average. China's literacy rate is now 100%. Functionally, everybody can read and write in China. Whereas in India, the literacy rate is still 75%. So you still have a significant portion of people who don't go to school, who don't get an education, who don't learn to read and write. China's per capita income is around 2.5 times higher than that of India. Access to clean water and modern energy. The whole population of China has access to clean water and modern energy, which, for an enormous Asian country, a developing country, is actually a huge accomplishment. Whereas in India, you still have 20 to 25% of the population that doesn't have access to modern energy, doesn't have access to electricity, essentially. Malnutrition, I mean, I don't want to speak overly negatively about India because India has made important progress. But there are still very large numbers of people that suffer chronic malnutrition in India. And that's not the case in China anymore. China has managed to eradicate extreme poverty so that it has nobody living under this kind of World Bank defined poverty line of around $2 a day. And in addition to that, in China, not being in extreme poverty also means that you've got access to, guaranteed access to food, housing, clothing, education, and healthcare. So that's another example of how China's developed to a much further degree than India has. And well, you mentioned Radhika Desai earlier, and one thing that Radhika always says is, the fundamental difference between China and India is that China had a revolution. China had a socialist revolution, and India didn't. And that means that China put political power in the hands of the people, specifically the working class and the peasantry, in an alliance with the intellectuals, in an alliance with the patriotic and more progressive elements of the capitalist class, the elements of the capitalist class that were willing to struggle against foreign domination, that were willing to struggle against feudalism. India, meanwhile, maintained political power in the hands of the elite, the landowners, the industrialists. Therefore, China was able to carry out land reform. This was key. There's really no factor more important, more critical when analyzing the differences between India and China than understanding that in China, land was taken out of the private ownership of big landlords and distributed to the peasantry. Land was given to the people who worked on the land. That set the scene for immediately solving all of the biggest problems that confronted the population. Because in both countries, you're talking about countries that at that time were 80 to 90% agrarian. 80 to 90% of the people lived in the countryside, worked on farms. And once you take away that massive inequality in the countryside, once you take away the situation where land and the product of the land are dominated by a tiny handful, a feudal elite, and you put land in the people's hands, you make it possible suddenly for everyone to eat. And this was possible because of Communist Party rule, because of the consolidation of political power in the social classes that had formerly been the oppressed classes. Whereas in India, the ruling classes, being the landowners, being the big industrialists, they've stood in the way of that type of social and economic progress for ordinary people. It's the same reason that China can now completely eradicate extreme poverty, the same reason that China can defeat COVID-19, the same reason that China can put this huge emphasis into solving the environmental crisis and investing in renewable energy and reforestation and all of these things, because it's governed, it's because political power is consolidated among the workers, the peasants, the intellectuals, and decisions are made on the basis of the needs of the people rather than the needs of capital, the needs of profit.
I would like to add that India is not a unique country, that it is more like a European Union. There are, I think, 26 states or stuff like this. And there are the states ruling by the communists in the south of India, the state of Kerala, which is much better in the alphabetization, how they manage the COVID problem and many stuff is better than other region of India, where is very big poverty.
Yeah, that's right. So the Kerala has since the early 50s been run mainly by the Communist Party of India Marxist, and then sometimes the Congress come in, and now there's like a left democratic front there, which I think the CPIM have the highest representation in, and as a result, Kerala, if you compare, I mean, my father's Indian, I've been to India many times and traveled around different parts of it, and Kerala really stands out for being much more equal, and it's still relatively poor, and I think even in Indian terms, it's a relatively poor state, but it's much more egalitarian. So one sees far less kind of open poverty, homelessness and starvation that one can see almost anywhere else in India. If you go to cities like Delhi or you go to cities like Mumbai or Bangalore, there are massive slums where literally millions of people are living in these slums on the outskirts of the cities. You don't have that in Kerala, and as you said, the literacy rate in Kerala is very, very high. It's close to 100%, much better than the rest of India. So there's always been a big focus on security of the basics of life: food, housing, clothing, education, and healthcare. And so and that is essentially the legacy of Communist Party rule.
Now I would like to ask you about the left in the imperialist countries. Especially, I think in Britain, we have the Trotskys movement, where I have impression that they are they made the political activity only to criticize the every revolution in the third world, that every revolution is not good. The Cuban revolution, China's revolution, Vietnam, it's always it's never a perfect revolution. In the same moment, this movement exists more than 80 years and never managed a successful revolution. And could you, I don't know, explain why there are so many people in the left in Western countries, which they attacked China, Vietnam, Cuba? Why they do it? especially now in the time of the COVID-19, when the success of the China is obvious for everybody. For the Polish bourgeoisie, Polish government, they send the Polish President Duda in the time of the epidemic. He called the President Xi Jinping and asked him to send a mask, asked him for all these things. In the same time, when he in Poland used all this anti-communist propaganda, when he see how the China managed the COVID problem, they called to Xi Jinping. And these Marxists from Western countries don't change. What do you think about them?
Yeah. Well, let's go into the big picture and the history a little bit, because actually what we see now with the left's response to the new Cold War is very similar to what we saw with the left's response to the original Cold War. And the level of propaganda is incredibly powerful. It's everywhere, and China has been turned into public enemy number one, and I think it's very difficult for people to accept being such a tiny minority when there's this constant barrage of propaganda telling society that China is a force for evil. And this isn't just at government, this is not just at mainstream media, but it filters down into social media. This is what young people talk about. My son is 18. So, I see, I've got some understanding of what his generation think about these things. And they pick up on rumors here and there, and they pick up on insinuations and slander and fake news campaigns that come from the media, and they turn them into, these viral lies, essentially. And I think, it's important to understand that, how it applies at a general societal level, and then we can dig into a little bit how that impacts on the left. I mean, one constant of imperialist ruling classes is that they're always going to seek to defend the status quo. They're always going to look to preserve and to expand the imperialist world system because they benefit from it. It's simply a matter of rich people wanting to continue being rich, and having governments and armies to represent them. And I don't need to tell you, there's something that emerges out of the capitalist system of production. Businesses compete. In order to compete, they have to capture markets, they have to get control of resources, they have to have access to cheap labor, they have to have control of intellectual property, and so on. And so at a global level, the basic drive of the whole capitalist system is to grab more land, grab more resources, more oil, more minerals, more food, find cheaper labor, expand exploitation to all parts of the planet. And any country, any movement that gets in the way of that is the enemy. The big enemy for a very long time was the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was the biggest threat to the status quo. And the US and its allies waged a Cold War against it, and big parts of the left participated in that, and that was the original Cold War. And today we've got the new Cold War. And the Cold War was a struggle for domination, for resources, for geostrategic advantage. And that also, I should say, involved a number of hot wars. The Cold War wasn't very cold in Korea or in Vietnam or in Laos or in Cambodia. Now things have shifted a little bit to China. China for a long time in the 80s and 90s kind of coexisted quite well in this imperialist, US-led globalized capitalism. And the West had been very happy to incorporate China into that, so long as China was content in its little place, at the bottom of the ladder, providing cheap labor, manufacturing T-shirts. That was fine. China was there. Chinese people were working very hard and helping to make a lot of Americans and a lot of Westerners very rich. But China had slightly different plans. China didn't want to carry on permanently being the manufacturer of T-shirts. And in that time, China has emerged, as a powerhouse, an economic, scientific, technological powerhouse. China is a few years away from overtaking the US as the world's largest economy. That's in GDP terms. Actually, if you use purchasing power parity, which is a more sensible measure, China's already the world's largest economy. I mean, by any reasonable measure, China's the world's largest economy, right? It's at the forefront of several important areas of science: 5G, artificial intelligence, supercomputing, nanotechnology, nuclear fusion, renewable energy, and so on. It increasingly plays a very important role in the battle against climate breakdown. It's shifted in a historically tiny period of time from being categorized as a low-income country to being a high middle-income country. And living conditions have improved to an incredible degree. China's got the same life expectancy as the US, right, of 77 years, with the difference that China is still going up. US life expectancy is going down. So China's this genuinely emerging economy that plays by its own rules, not the rules of the US. It doesn't integrate into this framework of US-led imperialism. So it's a threat. And it was very isolated, and now it's not very isolated. It's the largest trading partner of the big majority of the world's countries. It's got very good relations with Russia. It's got very good relations with Iran. It's got increasingly very good relations with Central Asia, with Southeast Asia. It has very close economic, diplomatic relations with most of the countries of Latin America, Africa, and Middle East. In terms of Latin America and progressive Latin America and the so-called pink tide, China's been critical to that. Venezuela, Bolivia, Cuba, they have extremely good relations with China. Hugo Chavez, who was elected in Venezuela in 1999 and who sadly died in 2013, he visited Beijing 6 times in that period, was very close to the Chinese leadership. And the Venezuelans were very grateful for all the support that they received from China. And the same with the Cubans. That China's, in terms of helping Cuba to emerge from the special period and that the disaster of the collapse of the Soviet Union, China was critical. So, China's become this big threat. It's become the #1 enemy. It's become this strategic competitor. And that's the basis for the new Cold War, for all of this information warfare, propaganda warfare that we've been talking about, that's also got a military component to it. The rising US and European presence in the South China Sea, that we've seen over the last couple of weeks, the announcement of this AUKUS military pact between Australia, Britain, and the US, which is a military pact and a nuclearized military pact. The expansion of this idea of the Quad, the Joe Biden's coalition of so-called democracies against China. It's a strategy of hybrid warfare to protect and preserve and expand the US-led imperialist world system. And some of the left goes along with it. Some of the left participates in this demonization. And I think probably, we might disagree on this. I think it's a little bit more historically complex than Trotskyists engage in demonization and others don't. Actually, you've got in the West a few interesting organizations that come from a Trotskyist background, for example, Workers' World or PSL in the US or the Trotskyist platform in Australia, which have really good positions in relation to China. And they even have really good positions in relation to defending the DPRK or defending Syria. And meanwhile, you've got some organizations that come from a Stalinist or a Hoxhaist tradition that can take objectively reactionary positions. So there's some kind of subtleties there that we can get into another time. But as to why this happens and why the left participates that participates in class war on the side of the enemy. There's a few aspects to it. One is that, you know, this hate propaganda, this slander, is so powerful, it's so pervasive, that it makes it very difficult to reject. Like at the level of social psychology, it's difficult to find yourself in a tiny minority. You know, I feel that, you know, that if I say something, if I defend China over its record in Xinjiang or Tibet or Hong Kong, I know I'm going to be subjected to a certain amount of abuse. And it's tough to deal with that. And I'll be considered by some people as not a good person, right? As like we talked about before, you can be labeled a genocide denier. Who wants to be a genocide denier? I'm trying to stick up for the global working class. I'm trying to stick up for socialism. I'm trying to stick up for the anti-imperialist movement. I didn't do that so that people can start slandering me and calling me a genocide denier. So it's really difficult to be in that kind of tiny minority facing this juggernaut of very powerful propaganda. You know, people have come to believe that China is a force for evil, so they don't want to be associated with it. They think it makes them look bad. They think it makes the idea of socialism look bad. Aside from that, I think people are very stuck on specific notions of what freedom is and what democracy is. And without necessarily consciously having this understanding, thinking that what we have in the West, capitalist, kind of liberal democracy, is the perfect system for running a society, even though we know perfectly well it isn't, even though, you know, we've all read Lenin's State and Revolution, and we all understand the limitations of capitalist democracy, and we understand that what we really live in is a plutocracy where power is determined by money. Even though we understand that our precious freedom of speech occurs within a very, very kind of narrow, this tiny band, we still look at China and say, well, that society is bad because it doesn't have human rights and it doesn't have democracy. Actually, you know, China simply has a different conception of human rights that prioritizes basic rights first, right? That's prioritized ending poverty, that's prioritized ensuring everybody has food and shelter and clothing and education and healthcare and running water and modern energy. And they've been incredibly successful with that. And that's why the Chinese government is extremely popular in China. And you look at poverty in Britain or in France or in the United States, and you wish they'd take a few lessons, read a few pages out of the Chinese book. And meanwhile, China also has its own form of democracy. It's socialist democracy, which is actually in many ways a lot more participatory than the form of democracy that we're used to in the West, which essentially means every 4 or 5 years you get to vote for 1 or 2 individuals or 1 out of 2 parties, that all of them represent capitalism, all of them represent imperialism. So the best you possibly get is the so-called lesser evil, right? So I think a lot of people in the West are just stuck with these lazy Eurocentric conceptions that prevent us from seeing what's positive in China. And then, you know, people on the left criticize the Chinese state because it's repressive. Well, yeah, you know, the Chinese state is repressive, but all states are repressive, right? That's the definition of a state. The Chinese state is set up to protect a social and economic system that has served the Chinese people extremely well for the last 72 years, a system that's relied on socialist democracy. And you know, that's why China's been able to achieve what it achieves. That's why it's been able to wipe out poverty and enact land reform, and why living conditions for ordinary people have improved constantly since 1949 because of the Chinese system. And so the Chinese state protects that system from numerous internal and external forces, mainly Western imperialist powers, that want to disrupt it. actually, we've got, in the West, on the left, we've got some agency there. We could get involved here, because if we want the Chinese state to be less repressive, then the responsibility is on us to stop our states from trying to interfere in China and to change its political system, right? That's on us. We can exercise a bit of control here if we think that China would be so much better if the Communist Party government was less repressive. Well, it's repressive because it needs to be repressive, because it needs to protect socialism from the forces of imperialism. We're here, we're in the imperialist country, so let's do something about that. Aside from that, I think there are some cultural differences with China specifically. For example, you have some sections of the Western left who find it easier to support Cuba and Venezuela than to support China. Even some people will find it easier to support Vietnam than would find it easy to support China. And I think a lot of that, even though China and Vietnam have got essentially the exact same political and economic system, right? I think a lot of that is down to cultural differences and the fact that China and Korea also are really not Europeanized at all. They don't adopt Western philosophies. They weren't colonized in the way that Cuba was, in the way that Vietnam was. And they continue to be essentially Asian and to have their own outlook that is difficult for Europeans or Europeanized people to understand. And that on the left, you would kind of think that we would make an effort to try and understand, and yet a lot of people don't. So those cultural differences, I think, get in the way of the Western left really engaging with what Chinese socialism or what Korean socialism is about and what it looks like in reality, and to focus more on learning from that rather than trying to project our dogmas and our ideals of what socialism should be onto other people. So yes, there are lots of people in the Western left that go along with the propaganda war on China. There are lots of reasons. None of them, I think, are very good reasons. But there you go. That's part of the work that people like you and I and others that we work with have to do, is to try and change that situation where you've got significant portions of the Western left participating in the Cold War on China, participating in the propaganda war, and as I put it earlier, engaging in a global class struggle on the side of the imperialist bourgeoisie.
It was very interesting what you said about this cultural difference. I have never thinking about this like in this manner, that because of Korea and China were never colonized by European, Korea was colonized by Japanese, but it was Asian. So the European leftists don't like them, and they like only the countries which are colonized by Europe. It is disgusting, but it is. I have to thinking about this. My last question, which I want to ask you, is about your. What do you thinking about the future of the China? Because the Communist Party of China, they said that in 2049 there will the socialism in China will be constructed. And I am from Poland, and in Poland was started the counter-revolution when the leaders of the party they make treason of the socialism and became a bourgeoisie. There are many bad things in China today, that there are the billionaires in the Communist Party, there are the that China is not perfect. So do you think that it will go to this direction, that capitalism, these billionaires in the party, they manage to make counter-revolution, or the socialism will be built, in your opinion?
Yeah, great question, and a big question. One thing I'll say to start with is that China started on its current strategy, what it calls reform and opening up, in 1978. So that's 43 years ago. And now in 2021, China's still doing very well. It's still growing in strength. Living conditions for ordinary people continue to improve. Social welfare is improving, wages are improving, life expectancy and child mortality and all of these indicators are improving, which is a very different trajectory to what happened in the Soviet Union, in Poland, in the GDR, in Bulgaria, in Romania, in Czech Republic. So, so far we seem to have quite a clear difference in how those two experiences are traveling. But I'll talk more about that in a bit. I mean, in terms of 2049, the CPC is talking about becoming what it calls a fully developed modern nation and a great modern socialist country by 2049, which is obviously the centenary of the People's Republic of China. And I think probably we don't know exactly what's meant by a great modern socialist country. I mean, sounds fantastic. Sign me up. But in concrete terms, what does it mean? I think it means that China will continue to develop, that Chinese people will continue to become more prosperous, and that there's going to be, and this, we can see this already happening, a shift towards what they call higher quality growth. That's not just about percentage GDP, but which always takes the environment into account, and that is very focused on people's all-round and overall well-being, not only income level. And we can see this already with the victory over extreme poverty complete from last year. The focus is shifting towards dealing with relative poverty. Of course, income will increase, but the idea is that there'd be much less inequality. So the living conditions at the bottom of society will improve faster than the living conditions at the top. And certainly the regional inequalities will be reduced. So the situation in 2049 will be that, whereas you've got big differences in living conditions now, depending on whether you're on the eastern and coastal cities, which is what the big, most populated areas, cities like Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, Xinjiang, and so on. There's a big difference in living conditions between there and the western and central regions. I mean, actually, this is something that's already in progress, and especially over the last 10 years, there's been enormous investment in the western provinces in particular. And you can go to Gansu or you can go to Xinjiang, and you can see that Urumqi, which is the capital city of Xinjiang, last year opened up its first metro line, which is pretty remarkable progress. And you go there, it's got an airport, it's got a train system, it's got very nice modern housing, very nice modern infrastructure. So these inequalities are being leveled out, and they'll continue to be leveled out. The idea is that by 2049, anywhere you go in China, east or west, north or south, people essentially will live well. Their basic lives are met. They have good opportunities. They have a good education. They can expect to enjoy a fulfilling life in terms of their work, their social life, their cultural life. So that's the plan. That's the vision, and it's obviously a very socialistic and people-centered vision. Are there risks? Are there dangers? Absolutely. There are internal dangers and there are external dangers, and the internal and external elements of that danger coordinate with each other and rely on each other and hoping that they can help each other out, right? Externally, as we've talked about, the West has shifted its position regarding China. The US and its allies now recognize that China is the big enemy, the strategic competitor, and so they've launched their new Cold War. They're stepping up their their encirclement campaign and their containment campaign, which, by the way, is not actually a new thing. The idea of containing China and overthrowing Red China goes back to 1949. It goes back to the US's support for the Kuomintang in the Civil War. It goes back to the US support for Taiwan, sending the 7th Fleet of the US Navy to the Taiwan Straits in 1950. It goes back to the Korean War, which was a lot to do with rolling back the Chinese Revolution. It goes back to the establishment of the first island chain, the use of Taiwan, Okinawa, Japan, the Malacca Straits as means of pressuring and containing China. So this is escalating. Externally, they're waging a propaganda war. They're waging an economic war, right? They're preventing the export of semiconductors to China. They're trying to get Huawei cut out of 5G infrastructure around the world. They're trying to ban WeChat and so on. So they're preventing Chinese academics and students from coming and working in the West because they don't want to share knowledge with the Chinese anymore. So that's a significant tactical shift from the West to actively prevent China's rise and to prevent its emergence as a major power. And ultimately, their aim is to overthrow socialism, is to get rid of the CPC government. And this is going to continue to be a very serious threat. It's a dangerous development. Internally, as you said, you've got a capitalist class in China. You have billionaires. You have people who are very rich and who want to see that wealth translated into political power, so that they can ensure that their wealth continues and that it continues to grow and that it's passed down to their children and so on. My view is that the Chinese have been quite consistent and quite steady when it comes to dealing with this group of people. They're tolerated, but they're not in charge. I guess you've seen the quote by Eric Lee from John Pilger's film, The Coming War on China, where he puts it quite nicely. He says he's talking about the political differences between the US and China. He says, in the US, you've got a group of billionaires, maybe 20, 30 billionaires, who essentially tell the government what to do. In China, it's a market economy, and you've got billionaires, you've got very rich people, but they don't tell the Politburo what to do. The Politburo tells them what to do. The government is led by the CPC, and that means that the government is representative of the working class, the peasantry, the intellectuals, and those progressive and patriotic elements of the capitalist class, with the working class as the leading class. When they started the economic reform, when they started introducing elements of the market and private capital into their economy from 1978, Deng Xiaoping always insisted on and talked about what he called the 4 cardinal principles. So number 1 is defend the socialist path. Number 2 is maintain the rule of the working class and its allies. Number 3 is maintain the leadership of the Communist Party. Number 4 is adhere to Marxism-Leninism, adhere to Mao Zedong thought. And I would argue that all generations of Chinese leadership have stuck pretty close to this because they learned from the Soviet Union. Nobody in China, well, no one in the Chinese Communist Party wants what happened in the Soviet Union to happen in China, because it was what happened in the Soviet Union was a disaster. Gorbachev wanted to introduce economic reforms. He wanted to introduce some elements of the market. He wanted to introduce some elements of private capital. And he found that politically, the people that supported those reforms also wanted political reforms. They wanted, a capitalist democracy. And over the course of just a few years, a new ruling class was created, a new bourgeoisie was created, and it was allowed to just take over power. And all of a sudden, this great socialist country disappeared from the map. The first country to build socialism, the country that led the defeat of fascism, the country that gave such profound support to the socialist movement globally, that gave such profound support to the national liberation struggles, that played its role in the dismantling of the colonial system, that gave critical support to, crucial support to the Chinese Revolution, to Cuba, to Angola, to Vietnam, which is, none of which is to say that there were never any problems in the Soviet Union. Of course, there were very serious problems, but its collapse was totally unnecessary and was an enormous setback for the working class globally. And China studied that experience very closely, very seriously. You probably come across the famous quote from Deng Xiaoping's son, where he says, "My father thinks Gorbachev is an idiot." As long as the Communist Party retains its control, as long as it retains its China on the socialist path, as long as it continues to have a vision of an advanced socialism and a trajectory towards communism, then my view is that what happened in the Soviet Union isn't going to happen in China. Economic reform, the introductions of markets, the introduction of private capital, the existence of foreign investment, Chinese foreign investment abroad, some level of integration into global markets and global value chains. All of this has gone way further in China than it ever did in the Soviet Union. And yet China stays red, and Mao's portrait still hangs in Tiananmen Square. And China's not stagnating. China's not declining. And you can see, actually, just in the last few months, there's some very interesting recent developments, such as this crackdown, the big pressure on Ant Group, the crackdown on tech companies, the crackdown on gaming companies, on private finance, on insurance companies. The government is asserting its authority. It's reminding capitalists who's in charge, and that's important. Capitalists, okay, you exist because we kind of need you, and because that's been part of our whole development strategy. However, you're not in charge, we're in charge, and we'll let you get this big, but we won't let you get this big. We're not going to let you get so big that you can start telling the government what to do. And the state continues to maintain, very tight control over the key parts of the economy, what they call the commanding heights of the economy: heavy industry, energy, finance, transport, communications, foreign trade. The big banks are all state-owned. They call them the big four, the four biggest banks. They're owned by the state. So the government controls finance, which is the most important in terms of planning the economy and figuring out your economic strategy. Finance is the important thing to run. Xi Jinping has said numerous times, socialism with Chinese characteristics is socialism. It's not any other kind of ism. So my view, and certainly my hope, is that China will stick to the socialist path, and I expect that it will continue to achieve, remarkable victories, not only for the Chinese people, but for the people of the world.
It was great, your lecture. I hope that somebody in Poland will listen this and he changed his view about China, because the leftist movement in my country are very, very weak, and the young people here are very they are useful idiots for the propaganda, for imperialist propaganda, and we need more people like you who know the socialist theory, who visited China, who can say all these things, because your things which you said, or here and in your channel, I suppose in your articles, in your books, is the best answer for all these lies, but unfortunately we are in the Western countries, people like us, we are in very, very small minority. So, but I hope that it will change.
Absolutely. And we need to keep working hard and keep coordinating, and on that basis, I really want to thank you for inviting me, for giving a platform, and for helping to create an environment online where we can have these conversations and we can have these discussions, and we can disagree with each other, but we can take this basic politics of socialism and anti-imperialism to a wider audience, because it's desperately needed.
Okay, I will finish the recording.